All right, we're going to start with a song as usual. This one was handpicked by our speaker tonight. So, as always, take this time just to slow down, come into the presence of God, make yourself present.
All this pain, I wonder if I'll ever find my way. I wonder if my life could really change at all. All this earth, could all that is lost ever be found? Could a garden come up from this ground at all? You make beautiful things, you make beautiful things out of the dust. You make beautiful things, you make beautiful things out of us. All around, hope is springing up from this old ground. Out of chaos, life is being found in you. You make beautiful things, you make beautiful things out of the dust. You make beautiful things, you make beautiful things out of us. Oh, you make beautiful things, you make beautiful things out of the dust. You make beautiful things, you make beautiful things out of us.
All right, so God made each of us, including our imaginations. And tonight we're going to use our imaginations to experience a guided meditation. Jesus said, "Seek and you will find." And if we seek Jesus and offer him our imaginations, we can meet him and spend time with him. So go ahead and close your eyes and relax. Listen to your breathing. As you inhale, breathe in all the love God has for you. As you exhale, feel all your distractions leave, any worries. Now picture right before you a large door, standing all alone. Go to the door, push it open, and walk through it. You find yourself in a beautiful garden. Take a moment to look around. Feel the grass beneath your feet. In the distance, you see a stream winding through the garden. There is a shade tree next to the stream and a bench beneath the tree. Jesus is there waiting for you. He smiles and calls you by name. Jesus takes you into his arms with a warm hug. "I'm so glad you came," he says. Come, let's sit down and be together for a while. So you sit on the bench and enjoy each other's company. Jesus takes you by the hand and says, I have been with you always, through times of joy and times of sadness. As you sit beside Jesus, you realize you can tell him anything. What do you tell Jesus? How does he respond? Now you both stand up to go. He invites you to return anytime and says he will be waiting. He tells you he will be with you throughout your journey. He takes you into his arms for a farewell hug. Go ahead and open your eyes again and return to this place.
Hi everybody, I'm Jake. Was it just me that got chills during that? Because I was like the whole time. It was really nice. Okay, maybe not. Okay. So I'm Jake. I'm a first year at CMC. I use he/him pronouns, and I'm really happy we're all here tonight. Thank you guys for taking time out of your week just to spend an hour with us in fellowship. I know it's final season and we're all pretty stressed out, but it's nice that you guys make the time. If you're here for the first time, which I think we're all, I don't think there's any new people. Well, if there's a ghost that's here for the first time, and they're willing to leave their information in the bag, blah, blah, blah. Anyways, okay, so we have a couple of announcements tonight. Okay, so tomorrow we're going to be getting off campus to go into nature, which is something we can all use to relieve some stress. We're going to be headed about 20 minutes in some direction to do a hike through some wildflowers. We're going to leave around 11. If you'd like to join, there's a sign-up sheet in the back. And yeah, it's just going to be a really nice time to get off campus and go see some wildflowers and take some really fire Instagram pics. Okay. And then next week is going to be our third to last fellowship meeting, which is kind of whoa. It feels like I just joined yesterday. Anyway, okay, so next week, instead of a talk, it's going to be a Q&A with Chris. Yeah, so bring your questions about the Bible. Oh, guys, this is Chris. Yeah, so bring your questions about the Bible, Christianity, faith, literally anything. And yeah, so it's going to be in here at the usual time at 7. And bring a friend. Bring anybody you want. Okay. All right. So right now is time for meet and greet. Go ahead and stand up and say hi to someone you haven't met. But like I said, we are all in fellowship. So go do that.
Hello. Wow, Jake, you're really tall.
Pleasure.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, there it is. Okay, I'll get started. Hello, everyone. It's awesome to be speaking for y'all once again. For those of you, yay! For those of you who might not know me, my name is Sagrika. I use she/they pronouns, and I graduated from Scripps last May. And now I'm an intern for CCF.
Yeah.
So today I'm going to be talking about pleasure and Christianity. What do you think of when you see these two words next to each other? Now, I know this topic can bring up different things for people. Some of us might be excited, others hesitant, or maybe some of us are just confused. So to bring us all on the same page, I want to define some terms. First of all, I want to give a definition for pleasure. Our society has conflated pleasure with sex, but sexual pleasure is just one of many types of pleasure. Pleasure is a feeling of happy satisfaction or enjoyment. It is the agreeable feeling that accompanies getting something good or much wanted. I think we can all remember times that we've experienced pleasure. For me, one of my earliest memories of experiencing pleasure is going to the amusement park with my dad. When I was 9, my dad got me and himself season passes to Great America, which is an amusement park in the Bay Area. And I just still remember the sweet smell of funnel cakes, the sugary texture of the churros, the splash of water from the loggers run, and of course, the rush of adrenaline from going on roller coaster after roller coaster after roller coaster for 3 months in a row. But this is actually a photo of my sister. It's very tiny, so you can't see, but like she's on the swing ride, and this is when I took her and her friends back in 2018. So going back to the definitions, another word that I'm going to be using a lot and want to define is sensuality. Sensuality is the enjoyment or pursuit of physical pleasure. So if something is sensual, it engages our senses in a positive way. And I want to make clear the distinction between sensual and sexual. While sexual is specific to sex, sensual has to do with all of our senses. Okay, so now that I've given us some background knowledge, let's jump in. I chose this topic for my last talk as a CCF leader because of my own experiences discovering the intersections of Christianity and pleasure. And so I'm actually going to use my personal journey as a framework to share what I've learned so far. I've divided it up into 3 stages: indoctrination, deconstruction, and reconstruction. So the first part of my journey, the indoctrination stage, starts with my initial exposure to Christianity, which was at the Lutheran elementary school I attended from 1st to 8th grade. Even though my parents are not Christian, they sent me to a Christian school. So growing up, I learned about a very traditional and conservative version of Christianity. This shaped me and my view of Christianity in many ways. But for the purpose of this talk, I want to focus on how it led to my conceptions of pleasure. Like some other Christians, our teachers believed that suffering was morally superior to pleasure. We focused a lot on how Jesus suffered during his time on earth, on the cross, in the Garden of Gethsemane, and when he was fasting in the wilderness for 40 days. This translated into us as children being told that suffering is vital to being a good Christian. Pleasure and fun, on the other hand, were looked down on and seen as wrong. One story that comes to mind is when I was in 3rd grade. It was a rainy day, so we got to eat lunch inside, and we got to watch a movie. We were watching Alvin and the Chipmunks. And we got so excited that we got to watch a movie because, you know, I don't know how many of y'all remember because you're kind of young, but when the teacher would bring that huge TV on the rolling thing, and it was so exciting. And so we were all really pumped and we just couldn't stop like giggling, you know, and just like we were just so ready. And we were laughing so much that like before the movie even started, this is like the beginning credits, that like the teacher got so upset she just turned off the movie. Yeah. And we were just laughing. But it was like it definitely reinforced that idea of like you should not be having too much fun even when we're doing fun things. And I think another more extreme example, probably the most extreme example of this, to really drive home how stigmatized fun was in our school, was when the pastor banned gift exchanges during our class Christmas parties. He said it distracted us from the true meaning of Christmas. So joy and fun were truly seen as oppositional to Christianity. And there were moral values attached to both suffering and pleasure. And this had a significant impact on the way I viewed them. I internalized that in order to be a good Christian, I needed to suffer and I needed to avoid fun. This mindset was really internalized because I was taught it at such a young age and it was enforced so strongly. I felt guilty for feeling joy and a kind of moral pride when I worked hard and deprived myself. I remember feeling proud when I would stay up late doing homework, thinking there's something morally right about sacrificing sleep for work. So this was the context in which I first started becoming a Christian. Despite all the trauma, I somehow still formed a personal connection with God and began identifying as a Christian at this Lutheran school. God truly can work through anything. However, having formative experiences in this environment definitely contributed to me later distancing myself from Christianity as a high schooler. I didn't want to keep feeling guilty or wrong for enjoying my life, and I associated Christianity with a stigma against pleasure. So that brings me to my first discussion question. Since we're a kind of smaller group, I want us to all kind of discuss together. So first, I'm going to give you all a minute to consider what I've shared so far. Are there parts that you relate to? Parts that you don't really identify with? I'm going to give you a minute, and then we're all going to come together and talk. I'll keep going. Thank you all for sharing. It was really cool to just talk with you and have a dialogue. So now I'm going to get back to my story. So like I said, I went through high school not really practicing Christianity because I distanced myself. And after graduating high school, I came to Scripps and found myself overworked and burnt out by my second year. I had continued to associate suffering, which looked like working without adequate rest, with some moral good. I pushed myself past my limits because I thought it was what I should do. And this is when I found CCF. And I learned a whole new way to look at Christianity, suffering, and pleasure. In my Lutheran school, we were taught that honoring the Sabbath meant going to church. And it wasn't until I joined CCF that I learned Sabbath is also an opportunity for us to get in touch with our need for rest and meet that need. This was paradigm shifting for me. God wants me to rest. God doesn't want me to suffer by pushing myself to the point of exhaustion. And instead of focusing on passages where Jesus suffered, CCF also looked at passages where Jesus rested, enjoyed time with his disciples, and dined lavishly. I saw how God models being human, and I realized how far it was from how I was living. I realized that suffering does not come from God. Another thing I remember is Chris explaining that the idea of the mind and soul being separate from and superior to the body actually comes from the Greek philosopher Plato. I thought Christianity had always believed that the body was inherently sinful and our minds and spirits had to overcome it. The reality is this comes from Plato and the philosophy of Christo-Platonism, a word coined by author Randy Alcorn. Christo-Platonism is basically the application of Plato's idea that spirit is good and matter is bad to Christianity. But Christianity itself does not inherently reflect that philosophy. So these are just a few snippets of my deconstructing journey. Learning about the Sabbath, about Jesus' life, and about where the separation of body and soul comes from contributed to me deconstructing the idea of suffering being morally good. I not only learned, but also internalized and believed that God does not want me to suffer. I put this into practice too, by resting without guilt and listening to my body. I no longer saw my body or my needs as something to conquer. I understood that my body is a gift from God and that I should respect its limits. So I want to pause again and ask you all about your thoughts. Does this part resonate? Do you feel like you did associate God with suffering and have unlearned that? I'll give you all a minute to think/share with each other, and then we're going to come back again as a big group. that was really cool. Does anyone have anything else to say? I don't want to like. Okay, cool. So yeah, during my deconstruction, I hadn't yet gotten to the point where I felt God encouraged pleasure. I just saw that God didn't support suffering. But I still see my moments, I still didn't see my moments of pleasure as from God. And that brings us to the third part of my journey, reconstruction, which began during the beginning of the pandemic, way back in March 2020. Some of us remember that 2-week spring break where we were all alone and had to somehow recover from a very chaotic and sudden removal from campus. I had relied a lot on my community for joy, and now that was not accessible in the same way. In some ways, all of the US was going through a similar journey of finding new ways to cultivate happiness. Baking, sourdough bread specifically, watching Netflix, and taking walks all became so much more central to our culture. Whether we called it that or not, we turned to pleasure. For me, this looked like finding new hiking trails, eating takeout, and stretching. Pleasure and sensuality were a solace and source of comfort during a very difficult time. Here is a photo of some amazing vegan chocolate chip cookies I made with my sister. This was literally during that 2-week spring break. Yeah, they were really, really great, and it was really fun. And it's just an example when I think of like the things that made me feel sort of okay during that time. So getting more in touch with my body through these activities helped me find joy in a very difficult and isolating time. I directly experienced how important pleasure is. I think it's worth mentioning here that the pleasure I'm talking about is one that makes me feel grounded and in tune with myself. As humans, we have certain desires, and we literally have pleasure centers in our brain that are activated when we fulfill those desires. And our desires are evolutionarily advantageous. It makes sense for us to feel pleasure while eating, or being with each other, or even having sex. However, our society has taken advantage of this biological design by creating things that activate our pleasure center, but also make us less in touch with our bodies and our humanity. Social media and fast food do have a place in our lives, and they're not the sources of pleasure that I'm talking about right now. I totally understand how cathartic a Netflix binge or TikTok wormhole can be. I've been there. And whenever it's over, though, I just feel numb and tired. This is different from the pleasure I experienced when going on a walk, for example, after which I would feel renewed and centered. Going on walks felt like a not only sensual, but also spiritual practice. I would talk to God as I felt the cool air, smelled the flowers, and heard birds chirping. I was activating my senses and experiencing pleasure while also practicing faith. This was significant because it became very difficult for me to stay connected to God throughout the pandemic. A lot of my spiritual practices had relied on community, which wasn't as accessible anymore. I struggled to find ways to practice my faith that actually felt meaningful. So these walks became really important. At many points, the only way I connected to God was through my sensuality. And this is what inspired me to explore the integration of sensuality and pleasure into my faith. I wanted to integrate them because pleasure had become something very important to my happiness and coping in this season of life. So one way I explored this was through the practice of sensual faith. Sensual faith is a term coined by LaVon Briggs, a Black woman who describes herself as a womanist preacher and writer. She explains that the core idea behind sensual faith is that God created us and created our bodies. Therefore, God created our desires, our pleasures, and our sensuality. She says faith is supposed to be fun and feel good. The idea is that we are made in God's image, and God is good. So our bodies are good. Let me repeat that. Our bodies, which are made in God's image, are good. Our desires, our sensuality, and pleasure are all good. Seeking pleasure is a way for us to practice our faith by experiencing the joy God created us to feel. Oops. Ignore. God created us to feel pleasure. Let me say that one again too. God created us to feel pleasure. There are two other women that I want to mention. They're not Christian, however, their work resonates with me greatly. And I have incorporated their ideas into my own conceptions and practice of sensual faith. The first of these is Adrienne Marie Brown, the author of Pleasure Activism. They have an amazing Instagram. Here are some highlights. There we go. Just funny memes. All right, I'm just gonna go back a bit so that it's not just like on the, can I go back on here?
Yeah.
Because that would be distracting. Okay. Brown talks about the power of pleasure and how it's a way to practice justice. Since I see justice as a core part of how I practice my Christianity, I see the combination of pleasure and justice as also a way to combine pleasure and my faith. Brown defines pleasure activism as the act of reclaiming our right to experience joy and pleasure. I conceive that as a divine right. We have the divine right to experience pleasure. We all have an inherent capacity for pleasure, and it's good. She connects it to justice by explaining that part of pleasure activism is making it more accessible to all people and removing the stigma against pleasure and recognizing that it is a right rather than something to be earned. It's healing for me to see sensual faith as not only me experiencing pleasure personally, but also me working to enable others to experience pleasure as God created them to. God wants all of us to experience pleasure, which requires centering the most marginalized in our pursuits of pleasure for ourselves and others. The second woman, Audre Lorde, is actually Brown's inspiration. Lorde's essay, The Uses of the Erotic, is the prologue to Pleasure Activism, which is the book that Brown wrote. Lorde defines the erotic as a resource within each of us that lies in a deeply female and spiritual plane, firmly rooted in the power of our unexpressed or unrecognized feeling. I understand erotic to be something of an intersection between sensuality, sexuality, and spirituality. I love this because it directly contradicts the Platonic concept of flesh and spirit as separate and opposing entities. Lorde tells us our bodies and our eroticism are not just good, but sacred. We can embrace our bodies and our souls as one divine creation. God made us erotic, and leaning into this is part of how I practice sensual faith. Sensual faith has helped me use pleasure and my sensuality to draw closer to God. I want to take a second and clarify that I'm not advocating for hedonism or complete overindulgence. There's a difference between pleasure and hedonism, and the conflation of the two is partly why we struggle so much as a society with accessing pleasure in a healthy way. However, so pleasure is getting in touch with our body's desires. It's looking beyond the body's basic needs and exploring what its wants are. And it's natural to have a fear of indulgence. And I think we can trust our bodies enough to tell us when we're about to go too far or when we already have gone too far. I don't think the fear of hedonism or going too far should force us to deprive ourselves completely. We can trust ourselves enough and we can trust our bodies enough to experience pleasure without it becoming hedonism. Okay, so going back to Reconstruction, during my senior year, I learned about sensuality and eroticism in Christian tradition through my early Christian sexuality class taught by Professor Sales at Scripps College. The saints and martyrs stood out to me as poignant models of Christian pleasure and sensuality, especially Saint Maria of Egypt. So Saint Maria's holy life begins with her running away from home and living a life of insatiable passion and uncontrollable lust. She had a strong, quote, love of pleasure and, quote, turned her lust into a free gift so that she could seduce as many men as she wanted. That's wild, right? Who would have thought that the lives of saints could be so sexually charged? So 17 years later, so for 17 years, she's just living her life. And after that, she goes on a trip to Jerusalem, prays to the Virgin Mary, and ends up living a life as an ascetic in the desert. So here she gives up all worldly pleasures and intercourse, but she still has desires, and she's still extremely erotic. She meets a monk who is the author of her hagiography, which is basically a biography for a saint. And he immediately kneels in deference to her when he sees her in the desert. He can sense her holiness, and he can tell that she's a saint, even in the midst of all her sexuality. Just another detail. She's like naked in the desert because, obviously. So he sees her and he's like, wow, this is a holy person. He even parallels her to Jesus. He writes a story of seeing her walk on the water to him. And he says that she lives in the desert for 47 years, mirroring Jesus' 40 days in the wilderness. Yes, chirp, chirp. This was such a cool hagiography to read because both Saint Maria's holiness and her sexuality are at the forefront. She is unequivocally and unapologetically erotic and sacred. What does it mean for a Christian hagiography to parallel someone who is very lustful and enjoys pleasure with Christ? For me, it really changes my perceptions of Christian tradition and has helped me learn how sensuality and pleasure has historically been integrated with Christianity. Okay, so lastly, I want to look at an example in Scripture. Yes, I said that, Scripture. This wouldn't be a talk on sensuality and pleasure if I didn't reference Song of Songs. Song of Songs, or Song of Solomon, is an Old Testament book in the Bible. It is a sensual and sexual love poem that is said to have been written by King Solomon about his favorite wife. It paints a beautiful image of healthy sexuality and pleasure. The passage I want to focus on is Song of Songs, chapter 4, verses 10 through 15. I know it's long, but stay with me. It's really beautiful. How delightful is your love, my sister, my bride. How much more pleasing is your love than wine, and the fragrance of your perfume more than any spice. Your lips drop sweetness as the honeycomb, my bride. Milk and honey are under your tongue. The fragrance of your garments is like the fragrance of Lebanon. You are a garden locked up, my sister, my bride. You are a spring enclosed, a sealed fountain. Your plants are an orchard of pomegranates with choice fruits, with henna and nard and saffron, calamus and cinnamon, with every kind of incense tree, and myrrh and aloes and all the finest spices. You are a garden fountain, a well of flowing water streaming down from Lebanon. I love the sensual language used here to describe this person's attraction to the woman. So many senses are activated when they mention perfume and honey and fruit and spices. It really is such beautiful imagery. And this passage is an intersection of pleasure and sensuality and Christianity I love that this is in the Bible. This models and encourages us to pursue pleasure. And the sensual language is helpful in expanding our ideas of pleasure beyond just sexuality. There's pleasure in taste and smell as well. It not only broadens the ways I can engage with my faith, but also it enhances my own practice of sensuality and pleasure. Now I even have a biblical model for it. I can do pleasurable and sensual things, such as eating or taking a bath, and recognize the spiritual and sacred nature of them. Song of Songs is a beautiful description of what Christian pleasure can look like. So, for our last discussion, I want to hear what you all think about Song of Songs, Maria of Egypt, and sensual faith. What feelings and thoughts are you feeling and thinking? And why do you think those things are being brought up? Okay, so turn to each other or talk or think amongst yourself. Think, and then we'll talk all together as a big group. You know the drill. was really awesome. Okay, so I started this talk by making it clear that sexuality, sensuality, and pleasure are all separate things. However, just as we all undergo a journey of exploring our sexuality, we all can explore our ability to experience pleasure. My journey began with unlearning that suffering is good and eventually progressed to the point where I could practice pleasure and view it as a good thing. We are all on this journey and in different places. So this idea might have deeply resonated with you and you might feel ready to dive right into pleasure. Or it might feel very foreign and you might want to start small. Just know that the more you engage in pleasure, the easier it becomes for your body to recognize it. We are all socialized to believe we don't deserve pleasure, and many of us were taught in church that pleasure is sinful. So deconstructing and reconstructing doesn't happen overnight. For me, being a new cat owner has been a great way for me to experience pleasure. Coming home to my cat and snuggling with him brings me so much comfort after a long day. And he reminds me that we all inherently deserve pleasure, and there's nothing wrong with desiring it. Also, another great way to experience pleasure, back. I almost got through the whole talk without really messing up, without needing Chris's help.
What do you want to be on?
The other photo?
Okay.
The one before, yeah, there we go. Also, another great way to experience pleasure is through ice cream. Here's a photo of the Scripps and Pomona South Campus community groups getting ice cream. So you could definitely also seek pleasure in community. It's been amazing to share my journey with you all and to be able to discuss and hear your insights as well. As always, feel free to reach out about anything I shared. And to end, I want you all to think of one way you can invite pleasure into your life this weekend. Personally, I'll be going on the wildflower hike tomorrow and getting lunch after. The end.
Give me 1 second, I need to pull up the Google Docs. Okay. All right, so thank you. Oh, nice. Sorry, she's very short. All right, so thank you so much for your talk, Sagrika. I just found myself thinking like the whole time, like it wasn't related to all the parts of the talk, but I was like, God cares about your mental health too, you know? And so it's not just me that cares about y'all's mental health. Yeah. So I hope that you all found something that you can take back from that talk. I know personally it's my friend's birthday tomorrow, and so that's how I'm gonna find pleasure in my life. But not too much pleasure because it's finals. All right, so stick around if you want after, and we're just gonna hang out for a little bit. And if you want to go on the wildfire hike, don't forget to sign up in the back. And y eso es todo. That's it's a thing in my Spanish class. It means and that's all.
Woohoo!